talk. And with that, I'd like to welcome Nick Sullivan from Cloudflare, and he's going to talk to us about DNSSEC.
All right, hello. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. I'm Nick Sullivan. I work at a place called Cloudflare. My main interests are cryptography at scale. So DNSSEC is one of those endeavors that requires cryptography at a very large scale. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about DNS. Everybody knows about DNS. This is one of the foundational protocols of the internet. And as a foundational protocol, it was built a very long time ago. And as such, it is completely insecure. So as DNSSEC, DNS is insecure. There was something that was created to help solve this problem, and this is called DNSSEC. So the motivation for this talk is to go over what DNSSEC is, what are the pros and cons of implementing it, and how deployment's going, kind of to motivate how it fixes certain problems of DNS and how it doesn't, and whether or not this has actually happened in real life or not. Okay, so everyone here probably has a basic background on DNS, so this is just a slight refresher to get you guys up to speed. So when I explain DNSSEC, it all makes sense. So DNS is really the largest distributed key value system that we have. Super redundant, super available, and it allows you to ask questions and get answers. So DNS is typically used and most often used for taking domain names and getting IP addresses out of it. So for example, you can ask DNS certain questions, such as, hey, what's the IP address of example.com? And it can give you probably most likely the first answer, which is this is an A record, this is the IPv4 address of it. Or it can, if you can say, hey, this other server knows, or it can say this domain doesn't exist. And this protocol is very compact, very small. So this is in hex, what it looks like a DNS request. This is a UDP packet, so it's very small. And you say example.com, you get it back. There's an ID to identify one from the other. Now, how does this work for browsing the internet or using internet services? Well, if you as a user want to go to a place called burritobot.com, you type that into your application. It has what's called a stub resolver that it's associated with. And this talks to a recursive resolver, which will answer the question for you. If it doesn't have the question cached, one of the main reasons that DNS works so well is because you have something called a TTL, time to live, so that records are cached for a given amount of time. But if it doesn't have it, it talks to the authoritative server, which is really the root of all knowledge about certain domains. And you can work your way down. There's something called the root, and then there's the top-level domains, .com, .org, et cetera, all the way to your typical domains. Now, once that gets back to your application, you can talk to the origin server because you have the IP address. Pretty simple, right? So Stub Resolvers, that's the interface with DNS for your application. It has a simple cache in it, but this is kind of being replaced by more powerful recursive resolvers on end-user hosts. So what are examples of recursive resolvers? Well, this is Google's public DNS is one, OpenDNS. You get one. Your local ISP needs to be able to resolve things. Earlier this year in Turkey, the DNS of the ISPs there were being rerouted and modified. So there was graffiti that people went around to let people know how to access the internet. And that's through, they were actually literally putting 8.8.8.8 on people's houses to let people get access to the internet. Eventually, this was blocked and it got resolved. So this is recursive resolvers. There are a lot of different ways of getting access to this. But it all ties into the same system. Authoritative servers, I don't want to toot my company's horn too much here, but if you look at the Alexa top 10,000, there are typically some consolidated in certain DNS providers, which for a website will provide the authoritative DNS. For those top 10,000 sites, Cloudflare is the top and very, very closely followed by Amazon's Route 53. And yeah, so this is kind of the overview. This has been working. It works great for everybody on the internet. Well, not everybody, but it seems to be working really great. Why is it insecure? Well, I'm going to describe a couple of very simple attacks that just prove that DNS can be modified and used inappropriately very easily. First, there's the standard man-in-the-middle attack. In this case, it's evil baby sitting in the middle. If you have somebody who has a privileged network position, someone that sits between a resolver, whether it's your stub resolver, and the authoritative server, or between any two DNS servers at all, you can take an answer and change it to whatever you want. And that resolver will cache the answer, and anybody else who queries it will get the wrong result. Now, this is pretty bad, right? But not all attackers will have a privileged network position to do that. So this was not really considered that much of a threat until a couple years ago. Dan Kaminsky came out with this attack, which is called cache poisoning. So the way that this attack works is based on the fact that UDP is the protocol that's used for DNS by default. This is an unauthenticated protocol. You can spoof the IP address coming out, and if a resolver asks a question to the authoritative server and an attacker beats the authoritative server back with a response, with a bad response, then the resolver will think that it's from the authoritative server. So this came out. There was a number of different ways that this was resolved, but it really points out that trust itself in DNS is not there. It's not baked in by default. And this is actually real-life attacks. This month, there were some cache poisoning attacks detected in the wild through passive DNS monitoring. This is actually happening, going on. So what can you do if you can modify the DNS? Well, you can make a very, very convincing phishing site because your domain is going to match exactly what people are expecting to go to. And more dangerously, you can redirect email. This is what was happening here, is DNS controls not only the web, but email. Every other protocol that uses domain names has to go through DNS. If you redirect certain domain names to a different IP address, you can get a whole swath of email, which is quite bad. All right, so what was the proposed solution for this? What is DNSSEC? Well, very simply, it's DNS with digital signatures on top. So public key cryptography gives you the ability to digitally sign pieces of information, and only the person with the private key is provably the one who can sign it. So this is an age-old public key cryptography technique, and as with every trust chain, every sort of trust scenario, trust scheme, you need to have a way to trust who you're talking to, like a root of trust. And in DNSSEC, it's very natural. It's the DNS hierarchy. So if you go www.example.com, the www goes to the example goes to .com goes to the root. That's how the chain of trust works. There was an original RFC back in the 90s, and it was kind of updated to DNSSEC BIS, which is, I guess, DNSSEC 2. This is the RFC that people are using right now, and this is standardized in 2005. It has a couple different things on top of DNS. So these are just new records. As before, you can have an A record with an IP address, quad A with a IPv6 address. There's a bunch of other different records. These are just new records. They have no specific special type to them. But so there's the RRSIG, which is a signature of a set of answers. If you have a bunch of A records, this is a digital signature of a canonicalized version of all those records. You have a DNS key, which is a public key. This comes in two flavors, one for signing the zone, meaning one for signing regular records and one for signing other key records. You have this thing called a DS, which is just a hash of the DNS key. It's actually not really necessary for DNSSEC, but it's part of the protocol. And the other thing that you need to do is to prove non-existence. So another thing that a malicious person can do is when you ask for a certain domain name, you can say this doesn't exist. DNSSEC, you need to be able to prove that the answer doesn't actually exist. Now, this is the chain of trust. It looks very long and kind of complicated, but I'll quickly walk through it. So if you have example.com is what your request is. It has a signature signed by a key, which is signed by a signature, signed by a key, and all of this is on the authoritative server. Now, Then it goes the next level up to the top level domain. So in this case, it's .com, which is managed by VeriSign. And so the DS record is the hash of the key signing key there, and it goes all the way up. And then the .com has its own key signing key, which is signed by the root. And the root key, this is what exists, and this is published everywhere. It's installed by default into recursive resolvers. And once, if you can check that entire chain, then yeah, absolutely, your A is valid, because trust is it goes all the way up this path. Now, how does this help? Well, man in the middle, if you have a server and it sends back the wrong answer, the signature is just not going to match. So therefore, it's caught. And then the resolver can say, no, this is not a valid thing. Same with the cache poisoning attack. If they send back responses that don't have the valid signature or missing a signature, the resolver can say no. So right, we're done, right? That's the end of the talk. Problem solved, right? No, absolutely not. And there's a reason that this talk even exists at all. There are several problems with DNSSEC and controversies about how it was designed and how it's going to be deployed. And I'm going to go over these right now. So there are 4 main problems: zone privacy, reflection amplification, the last hop, and complexity and risk. Let me walk you through these. Zone privacy. Well, zone privacy is a feature that you don't know, that if someone wants to know what all the subdomains are for a certain domain, they can't just figure those out. This is really a good feature for if you want to keep subdomains anonymous. You don't want people going to different subdomains. But in DNSSEC, you can't necessarily keep those subdomains private. It changes something fundamental about the internet. So I'm going to talk about how that works, NSEC walking it's called, and they tried to fix it with something called NSEC 3, which turned out to not really fix it all the way. And eventually, I'm going to explain how to really solve this problem. So the way zone walking works is, as I mentioned before, an NSEC record is a proof of non-existence. And if you're creating a DNS zone that has all sorts of subdomains under a main domain, you can sign the gap. This is how NSEC works, is you sign the gap between any 2 domains, and you say nothing exists between these 2. And this can cover the entire set of domains in your zone. Basically, with one record for each, one NSEC record for each record, you put one in between. And so, for example, if you query IETF and you look for tx.ietf, it says, no, there's nothing between trustee and www. And if you ask for wwwa, there's nothing between www6 and this XML to RFC, which just this alone is a little indicative of the fact that IETF doesn't necessarily want you knowing that trustee exists or XML to RFC exists. This is sort of removing this zone privacy. So if you just keep guessing the next gap, you can figure out what every single subdomain is, right? That's not necessarily a good thing. NSEC 3 is you're not signing the gap between domains, you're signing the gap between the hashes of the domains. So this is like a password hash with assault, and you can walk the gaps between hashes in this case, and then do an offline dictionary attack to figure out what these are. So it's really not as powerful as it has originally was claimed to be. So the solution for this is something called white lies. This is, again, another Dan Kaminsky suggestion. And if you can sign records on the fly, sort of sign them after the request is made, you can sign something like this. So if you want to prove that something.com doesn't exist, you can sign the NSEC record that says somethf with all these z's to something 00001. That covers your gap, but it doesn't reveal what the next domain is. So this kind of solves the zone privacy problem, but live signing has its own problems on top of that: key management, CPU usage, and implementations. I mean, this is not something that bind does by default. And there are kind of just thoughts around this, is that It's very similar to TLS and sort of HTTPS deployment in that you need keys in all of your end servers. So are keys safe? Well, yes, unless there's a heartbleed in DNS or something like that, right? And CPU usage, our CPUs nowadays are pretty powerful. You can do live signing very quickly, and especially if you use elliptic curve keys, which cost around 10 to 20 times less than RSA keys. So you can kind of get around these problems. They're not as severe as they seem. But here's one that is potentially very bad. This is amplification reflection. Now, as I mentioned earlier, UDP is an unauthenticated protocol. You send one request and you get one back. Not all networks do egress filtering. So if you send a request from one network and you say you're from a different network, there are certain places where they don't filter that. They just allow you to send these requests. So if you send a question and ask for a DNSSEC answer, you can get a small request that turns into a very big response that can go to anywhere, that it'll get sent to anybody you want. Now, the way this is really, really bad for the health of the entire network of the internet is this example right here. So let's just say you have an attacker with 1 megabit per second of bandwidth. They have 10 bots, and they can trigger each of these bots to send a fraudulent request to these 400 amplifier machines, which could be DNSSEC resolvers, and point them at a victim. You can get from just 1 megabit per second with 10 bots under your control up to 500 gigabits per second, which will shut down almost anything, any pipe that we have on the internet right now. So this is really bad. So what are the solutions to amplification? These are kind of the age-old problems of network security. You can use TCP. This is actually part of the full DNS protocol. It's required in the RFC that you can fall back from UDP to TCP. But this actually didn't happen in practice all the way. About 16% don't retry from. If you do a DNS request with UDP, you can send a truncate flag, which requests that you try again with TCP. A lot of servers don't do this. And there are worries about how heavyweight TCP. I mean, TCP is not very heavyweight, but it does require one back and forth, one handshake before you can start exchanging messages and state on both sides. But there's a research project called TDNS, which is kind of proving out the case that it's not too bad to do DNS over TCP. So that's not a full solution for this amplification problem. Use elliptic curves. This is another option. One of the reasons that responses are so much bigger than requests is that DNS keys and RRSIGs are tied to the size of the cryptographic keys that you use. And RSA is the default. This is 2048 bits. You can use something called elliptic curve key, which will give you the same security for about 200 to 300 bits. And therefore, you have the smaller amplification ratio, and people don't go after the small amplification ratios. They go after whatever the biggest one they can get. Earlier this year, there was an NTP reflection attack. People stopped using DNS for doing amplification attacks. They switched over to using another protocol that had a higher amplification ratio. So if you can keep the amplification ratio down, you can keep this from being abused. But universal support for this is also lagging. What about the last hop? This is another thing that people bring up, which is the communication between the stub resolver to the recursive resolver. This DJB suggested something called DNS curve, which is basically like a TLS authentication layer, encryption layer between the stub resolver and the recursive resolver. As recursive resolvers get moved into endpoints, this is less and less of a big deal. Now, here's the big one for making suggestions to change the network infrastructure, the basic substrate that all of our services are built upon. And this is just very scary for these people to do. This is a very risk-averse group of individuals that manage how the network works because downtime is extremely expensive. There's not much I can say here other than, well, yeah, it is a little bit, it's complex to manage keys and to rotate them, and it is risky if things don't get managed exactly correctly. So not much you can say there. So as an overview of the problems, 2 of them are kind of knocked out, but there are still 2 problems that remain. And balancing pros and cons, what are the positive things? Well, you get security and trust of DNS, and what else? Can you get anything else from DNSSEC? Well, DNSSEC actually provides you the ability to put more information into the DNS. And one of these suggested additions is something called DANE, which is putting TLS certificates, website certificates, inside of the DNS. And since the DNS is trusted with DNSSEC, then you don't have to rely on the certificate authority system to go and trust that the certificate you're using is the correct one. As recently as a couple months ago, the Indian government was found to be minting Google.com certificates, and other of these certificate authorities in the past have been compromised to give certificate authorities. The trust in actually the little lock for TLS on websites is really kind of, it's risky. There are hundreds of these trusted certificate authorities. In DNS, there's only one root of trust, and that's the DNS root. So this is a good suggestion on top of it. Questions about the trust chain are, well, each registry controls the keys for the top-level domains. So if you have a kind of hipster service that's on a .ly, then you're really implicitly trusting the Libyan government with your keys. That's something that people have questions with. I don't know. There's alternative ways of getting around this. But yeah, DANE is another really positive thing you can get from DNSSEC. So what about, how have we done so far in getting this out there? Have people deployed DNSSEC? Well, what do you really need to have in place for this vast improvement in trust for DNS to work? Well, you need to have the top layer of the trust chain, meaning the roots and the top-level domains, and then you have to sign your domains themselves, and then everyone who visits them, the resolvers, have to actually check these signatures, and then end users have to be alerted. So there are quite a few steps, and we're different ways along for each one of these. The root, this is the root of all trust, was first published in 2010, and there's this kind of magical key ceremony where the founders of the internet all get together and create the key together and on like a hardware security module, and each of them have a piece of the puzzle, and it all comes together. It's actually a pretty fascinating story, the way that they do this, but it was published in 2010, and that's the root key if anybody's interested. So the TLDs have started to be signed, so .org was the first who was actually signed before the root, and others are following suit, and this is kind of the graph and the worldwide picture. This spike right here is all the new TLDs that were introduced in 2013. So .insurance or .microsoft or whatever all these new ones are, they're required to be signed by DNSSEC from the start. So this kind of tracks as the new TLDs are deployed. Individual domains, well, we have a long way to go. Honestly, only 0.3% of .com domains, which is still about 400,000, are signed. .nl is way in the lead. A lot of the Netherlands, they've done a lot of work for DNSSEC, and .eu is all the way up to 7%. There's this site that tracks them, and you can actually see there's a category. The purple line is NSEC walked, so they actually use the fact that zone privacy is weak to actually figure out which domains are signed and which aren't. They obviously haven't gotten to 1 million, so they haven't found them all, at least in this project. And what about the resolvers? Did they validate? Well, Google DNS, yes, they validate. So unless you set a specific bit saying don't check, it's called CD, which is checking disabled, then yeah, they'll validate it, OpenDNS. Not sure if they will or not, but they've mentioned it in the past. So AppNic has done a survey, and they have also this kind of chart right here, which is great, which describes how many of the requests over DNS are asking for DNSSEC. And this is all the way up to 12%. So compared to 1 year ago when it was down at 9%. So this is actually growing pretty well. if you have a site, how do you turn on DNSSEC? Well, you have to go through your registrar and upload your DS record, who then, the registrar uploads it to the registry. And yeah, there's about 30 to 35 registrars that support this. GoDaddy has a pretty good interface. Some of them don't support elliptic curve keys, though. What about browsers? This is kind of the last stage in the chain. So we have the root assigned, some of the TLDs are signed, some of the resolvers check. How do you know if a site that you're going to is valid on DNSSEC-wise or not? Well, there's, right now, no browsers do it by default. Chrome did for a while in one of their Canary branches, but there's this plugin right here for Firefox and Chrome called DNSSEC Validator that you can use, which gives you a nice green key if it's signed, and if not. It also has a secondary one for DANE, if DANE's enabled or not. So just in summary, the trust chain is mostly established. Some domains are trusted. Resolvers need to check. Some do. And users are not alerted right now. So to answer the question, how far have we gone? It's not that far, but we're on the right track. So it's slowly happening. My company, Cloudflare, is going to be enabling DNSSEC by the end of the year, same with a lot of other companies. And the Internet Society's Deploy 360 campaign is tracking all of this development. If you want to keep track of how this is moving on, they have a great site on that. So the future is yet to be determined. That's it.